Good. So what to change? We talked about this, least amount possible, risk-based approach, things I'm comfortable. In fact, I encourage that the first one is changing your database structure from type 1 to type 2 or optimizing. That one I'm fine with because you're dumping and loading. Anyways, get off the route as quickly as possible. That one I'm pretty comfortable. Open edge replication, CDC Pro 2, those are things we've just done a million times, so we're really comfortable adding those during a migration. And ISO 859 to UTF-8, it's a good time to do it, but there is a lot of risk. There's a lot of testing you should do. But you have to dump and load, or it's better, so you might as well do it now anyways, rather than doing what they call a conf car later on. Okay? And I talked about this earlier, right? So how much time do we have to do our migration? And don't forget that you have to take into account rollback time, right? So what's your drop dead time? Yeah. Your go, no go drop dead time. And this, I think this is probably the most important one that I tell people here, is define milestones goals with time markers. So there's two reasons we do that. One, when your boss comes to you and says, where are you in the procedure? You show him where you are in the migration, and you can show him where you thought you were time-wise versus where you are. So you can say, I'm an hour ahead of schedule, or I'm 45 minutes behind schedule. This is why I'm behind schedule. This is why I'm ahead of schedule. But this is where I am in the procedure. Everything's good. It also means if you have these markers, you can more objectively make the decision to scrap the migration, right? And it's really hard. Like, you work so hard for so long to prepare this migration. Like, it's really, really hard to look your customer or your boss in the eyes and say, scrap. We're not going to make it. This is not going to work. But if you have all of this stuff documented with time markers, it's easier to make that objective decision to say, we're not going to make it. Stop, go back. Monday we'll regroup, we'll do a post-mortem, and we'll schedule to try again in a month or whatever the case may be. All right? And define success. So how do you define success? Well, on your dump and load, do you have the same number of rows before and after in every table? That's kind of important, right? If you run financial reports, are they showing the same numbers before and after? Did you do all your business processes, right? Did you pull EDI orders down and push EDI orders out, or 856s or whatever invoices? Did you make that connection, right? Did someone in the warehouse go with the gun and pick an order? And we see that all the RF guns work. So define all of those success markers during your go, no go here, all right? And then inventory, what's dynamic data versus static data. So obviously we know the database is going to be dynamic. All right, we have to dump and load the database when we're migrating, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff. There's code, there's flat files, there's all the stuff that's coming in from your customers, all the PDFs that you're generating. All of that stuff needs to be migrated also. So take all of that into account. Certainly, I tell people to code freeze and dictionary freeze at least 2 weeks ahead of time. And why? Because your DBA is going to prepare his migration. He's going to prepare the new machine for dump and load. And this has happened, I don't know how many times. You do all your prep work and you go to do your load and the schema's changed. And you find out that since you prepared the empty database for the load, they did a dictionary change. And now you're scrambling to recreate databases because they did a dictionary change. So yeah, freeze your dictionary, freeze your code. Everything else, rsync it. Just set up an rsync to automatically synchronize all the data between the old servers and the new servers, right? In the week leading up to going live. And then on go live, you just finish those synchronizations, and then your new server is fully synchronized for data, right? Create your users, of course, your printers, and decide how network changes. So are you going to take the old IP address and assign it to the new server? Did you change VLANs? Are you going to make just a DNS change? So you're going to keep the host name, but now there's going to be a new IP address. So make sure you document all of those changes and all the people who are involved in making those changes when you do the migration. Good. And the database. Typically the longest part, and not only is the dump and load typically the longest part of the migration, there's usually one or two, we call them long pole tables. So there's usually one or two tables in the database that are going to take the longest to dump and the longest to load, and they will actually define the length of your dump and load process. Everything else can kind of happen in between the dump and load of these one or two very, very large tables. And especially true if you're dumping from a type 1 storage area, because that very large table will be written across the entire physical database, which means you're reading the entire database when you dump and load. So we are working with a customer just recently now who has everything in the type 1 storage area. They're about to hit the physical limit on the size, so now they have to dump and load. They've been putting it off and putting it off and putting it off, but they're within, I would say, 2 months now, right? So ProTop has a feature where it tells you how fast every table is growing and how, like, what the expected size is in a month and 3 months. So we can see, we extrapolate, okay, in 3 months you're going to blow the table, whatever, 1 month. So they know when D-Day is coming. So we started doing these dump and load tests, and we were able to get it down from like 12 hours to 8 hours to 6 hours to 4 hours. Now we're trying to get it down to 2 hours in terms of the dump and load, right? And there's lots and lots of strategies that you can do in terms of trying to get that long pole table dumped in a relatively short period of time, right? You can do multiple simultaneous dumps. We can use your dev, test, and QA server. So we can copy the database to all of the servers and dump partially from all the different servers. There's a whole bunch of different ways. If it's historical data, we can dump a lot of it ahead of time because it's not going to change anyways. So maybe you can dump 90% of the data in the week leading up to the migration. And then at go live, you just dump the last 10%. Or worst case scenario, you use Pro2 dump and load, which kind of uses change data capture to keep that other database in sync. And so the downtime is quite minimal, but obviously the effort ahead of time is much higher to get all of that set up. Good. All right. Multiple servers, more RAM, more disk space, of course. Watch out for third parties. This is always my favorite thing. So if you're dumping and loading to a SAN, well, guess what? On the weekend, Oracle and Microsoft SQL Server are also doing their backup. So, you've timed your dump and load perfectly, and then on go live morning, you're going at half the rate that you think you're going. Well, the reason is because the Oracle guys are backing up their 11 terabyte data warehouse at the same time. So make sure you coordinate with those other teams that are on the same SAN so they're not hogging all the resources while you're supposed to be doing your dump and load. All right, and test. I said this at the beginning, I'll repeat it again. Go live is not the time to think. So you should be able to do this practically with your eyes closed. All of the steps should be very well documented. Who does what steps? In our case at White Star, we have a dump and load Google sheet that's shared among all the participants, and then whoever's doing a step will actually go and change the status of the step to in progress, or so you know who's doing what dump, who's doing what load, who's doing what other part of the migration process. So if it's more than one person, we don't trip on each other's toes. And at the end of the day, I got a sheet that's all green that says all of the steps that I needed to execute were actually completed and who completed each one of the steps on each one of the databases. Right? And test. And this last one here often gets missed, which is load testing. So everyone does the dump and loads, they do the testing, they get the users to come in and start testing the system, but they never load test the system. All right? What happens when 500 users come on the system? We had a client who brought in 400 warehouse employees on a Sunday morning to load test their new system. They were migrating hardware and they were upgrading the application. The application was Infor SXE, which is a warehouse management application. They brought 400 employees in on a Sunday morning and the test failed. Everything was great, but when we put 400 users on the system did not respond. And they have 1,600 users in production on Monday morning. So 400, we didn't make it. Test fails, everyone's freaking out, everyone thought we were ready. We do the postmortem on Monday, figured out what the problem was, resolved the problem. A month later, they brought 400 employees again on a Sunday. We passed with flying colors, but it also means that the Monday we went live, 1,600 users were working on the system with almost no problems. So don't forget to load test on your new system. And good. Last thing, again, go live, not the time to think. Go live is the time to do, is to execute your procedure. Questions? We're wrapping up here. I talked about this objective about a no-go. Good? All right. My top 10 hard lessons learned. Running out of disk space. It's inexcusable to run out of disk space, right? If you didn't plan for your disk space, for your dump and load, and you're scrambling, that's inexcusable. And I tell people, whatever disk space, whatever the database size is, you probably need 5 times. So if you're a 100 gig database, you probably need 500 gigabytes to do your dump and load. All right, so that's a good rule of thumb in terms of disk space for your dump and load. Number 2, your production hardware is not the same as your test hardware. Again, seeing this all the time. Sometimes you get lucky and production hardware is actually faster, but sometimes you come in and the production hardware is slower than the test hardware. So again, this is why we want to benchmark your new hardware before you go live on it so that we know how fast the hardware is going to be. Number 3, there's this concept of peak and sustained throughput on Azure and on AWS, which means how fast you can write to disk, how fast you can do write through the network. And AWS will give you what they call peak credits, typically 30 minutes per day of peak credits. So you're doing your testing and you're like, I'm dumping at 8 gajillion records per second. I only need to, I'll do it for 10 minutes and then extrapolate to my 10-hour dump and load. So then my dump and load will be great. And then after 30 minutes, your dump rate goes like this, right? Because you just used up all of your peak credits on AWS, and now you're at your sustained minimum on AWS. So if you're going to do, again, these tests, make sure you work through those peak limits and you know that you're benchmarking at the slower speed, not the faster speed. All right? This one too, so you're FTPing files, SCPing files, you're telnetting in, SSHing in. There's always the concept of known hosts and the SSH keys. You get that message, this server is line 7 in known host, but now the key changed. Do you want to update it? Well, guess what? None of your SCPs and SFTP copies will work because of this. So make sure you do all of those manually ahead of time so those processes will work when you go live. Next, DNS entries, IP addresses. So again, if you're changing IP addresses, make sure you've documented well. What's the process? Okay, the old server is going to get this IP address. The new server is going to get the old server's IP address. Or, okay, we're not changing IP addresses, but we're going to change the DNS. So this host name points to this new IP address. So make sure that that's documented properly. And again, watch out for servers that have multiple IP addresses. So this is another thing where you get caught. And then you start the app servers, and the app servers are listening on another IP address, not on the IP address that you think they are. And then you don't understand why you can't connect to the app servers. All right, firewall rules. So production is usually more strict, right? So you're running your tests, everything looks great. Then when you move that into production, all of a sudden the firewall rules are much more strict, and now there's XYZ applications that aren't working anymore. So again, make sure you document your firewall rules very, very well. And an easy way to do this is, so again, swap the IP addresses. So make sure the new server gets the old IP address, because all the firewall rules will be geared to that IP address.
What's your experience in PASA migrations as far as everything shut down, surprises, or that just need to be tested thoroughly in the production environment to make sure that all of the appropriate switches are on?
For PASA?
Yeah. So somebody switching from non-PAS, from going to 11.7.
From classic to PAS.
Yeah, well, not even, and then to 12, to version 12.
So we recommend going PAS on 11 first. And the reason for that is because if you go from classic to PAS on 11 and there's a problem, you just go right back to classic, right? You put your tail between your legs, you run back into the lab, and you say, okay, let's try this again. If you jump to 12 and there's a problem, we dealt with this recently, had a customer, they jumped to 12 into PAS, there was no going back to classic, there was no going back. And so we had to figure out what the problem was. It took 3 weeks to figure out what the problem was, but we figured out what the problem was, and we resolved the problem. And it turned out to be a coding issue. So I definitely say go 11 PAS first, make sure it's stable, 11.7 latest, and then from there go to 12.2 LTS or 12.8 LTS that's going to come out soon. And then there really monitor, you have your Apache, your Tomcat connections, and then you've got your Tomcat threads, Tomcat connections, Tomcat threads, and then you've got your multi-threaded agent threads over here. You have to monitor all three to make sure that you're not running out of one of them essentially, right? And which one is blowing up memory on you. So when do you age out your sessions? If you don't age out your sessions appropriately, your Tomcat runs out of memory. Watch your queuing. Are you queuing at the Tomcat level, or are you queuing at the multi-threaded agent level? And all of that data is available through those OE Manager REST calls. And even us in ProTop, we're probably 20% of the way in terms of monitoring all of those things adequately. As we add more customers on PAS, we're adding more and more of these monitoring tools. Thanks. We're good. All right, Azure proximity placement groups. Really, really important for this, especially if you have client-server applications, or if you're building, again, multi-server applications. So with PAS on little Linux boxes and the database on another, make sure all of your servers are in the same proximity placement group. Otherwise, your network latency is going to be very, very high and your performance is going to be terrible. And again, in ProTop, we have a very specific metric just for this particular problem that we calculate to tell you, oh, there's this latency that you need to deal with. But make sure all your servers are in the same proximity placement group on Azure. Good. And then bandwidth users, again, I talked about this earlier. If you're doing a big dump and load, coordinate with the other teams in your business to make sure that they're not doing 100 terabyte backup when you're supposed to be doing your dump and load. All right? Because it's very hard to find out. They just scheduled it. Nobody's working, right? And then you look at the SAN, and the SAN is just not giving you the performance you expect. And again, the usual culprit is this: someone's running some big job or big backup or big something else, absolutely unrelated to you, but you're on shared infrastructure. Number 9, over provisioning. I hate this. I really hate this. If you have 32 cores, then provision 32 cores. We come to customers, they've got 32 cores, and they've provisioned, 120 cores to their servers. So God forbid somebody else needs CPU. Well, guess what? You're battling with the hypervisor to get the CPUs that you want. So do not over provision. Please don't over provision. And there's another thing called what's it called? The bubble driver. What's it called again? Does anybody remember what the balloon driver? The balloon driver. Has anybody heard of the balloon driver? So if you over allocate RAM on your hypervisor on on ESXi, when you install the VMware tools, it installs what's called a balloon driver. So it can go to your server and say, listen, I need 8 gigs of RAM from you because you're not using it. So the balloon driver requests 8 gigs of RAM from the operating system, holds that 8 gigs of RAM, and then gives it back to the hypervisor to give it back to another server that needs it. So you're sitting on the server, we've had this, and we're like, why are we using 64 gigs of RAM? Like, the minus B is this, and my users are calculating to that. I only calculate that we're using 21 gigs of RAM, but the server is showing 32, and then we find it, oh, there you are, the balloon driver just took 20 gigs of RAM, right? And we actually created in Protop a thing called Dirty Mem that calculates which processes are using memory, so we can see the top 10 consumers of memory. We expect to see the databases, but sometimes we're surprised by seeing some of these other things as the top consumers of memory. Good. And then incorrectly provisioned cloud disks, number 10. Again, are you using GP2? You don't need to use GP2s anymore. You should not be using GP2s. You should be using GP3s today. I don't really think there's a reason to use IO2s. If you think GP3s are not good enough for you, come talk to me. We'll talk about ephemeral disks. And then the same thing on Azure using standard, premium, or ultra disks. I think they're pricier on the Azure side versus the AWS side for the same given performance. But if, again, you pick the wrong disks, your performance is going to suffer. And that's it. Two questions. I'm out of time. Right.
One thing, so if you use a strategy, so your application is part of an ecosystem.
Right.
And you use a strategy to swap IP addresses. How do you test that ahead of time?
You don't. No, I mean, that's something you can't really test ahead of time. Right, because you basically take the old server, give it a new IP address, and then take that old IP address and assign it to the new server. But I don't think there's a way to test that process ahead of time. So, I don't know, Mark, you have anything, really? Anyone else, questions? Yeah.
So with that ballooning, if you do a reservation on like vSphere, to reserve the RAM, will it still take it like that?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I don't know how strict it is and how loosey-goosey it is with stealing RAM.
Loosey-goosey.
More questions? All good? Come see us at the booth if you have other questions or you want clarifications, but otherwise, thanks everyone. And